Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Prosperous Empath. Kat here. I am feeling pretty tickled and honored to have our guest, Julie Bjelland, join me on the podcast today. Julie is really a leader in the field of high sensitivity, and I feel humbled to have her join me today on the podcast, talking about her own journey and some of the major reinventions she's had, some of the big pivots she's made in her business and the work that she's up to of late. And what's really cool about this conversation is that when Julie and I originally connected at the beginning of this year, she was focused in a really different area of business. And as prosperous empaths, I think something I appreciate about us is that we are always open and committed to reinvention and following the non-linear path, which we've talked about in the show before, and also creating an outside the box business and business model. And that looks like a whole lot of self-permission to reinvent, to change direction, to completely overhaul who you are, what you stand for, and what you talk about in business. And today's conversation, if anything, is just that. So a little bit about our guest, if you don't already know who Julie is. Julie is a highly sensitive, autistic, LGBTQ plus licensed psychotherapist, author, and founder of the Sensitive Empowerment Community. She specializes in high sensitivity and adult diagnosed autism in women, helping them reach their fullest potential and excel in their unique talents. Now, what's really awesome about this conversation is, first of all, it comes on the heels of last week's conversation and interview with Regina Carey, where we talked about neurodivergence and specifically ADHD. And today we're exploring the topic of autism. Julie recently received her own adult diagnosis of autism, and that has really fueled some of the new directions that she's going and growing in her business and what she feels compelled to talk about. Now, for me, this was a really fascinating conversation and one filled with a lot of new learnings for how to support those with autism, and also what are the qualities and traits of those who face autism. So today on the show, we're going to dive into Julie's story of self-discovery and really receiving that diagnosis and how embracing it has not only changed her life, but also the entire trajectory of her business. And I think that this is going to be really helpful for some of my listeners, because I know as highly driven, high-performing empaths, we can get so attached to how we identify ourselves through our work and what we stand for, and giving ourselves permission to reinvent, overhaul, or completely change the trajectory of our business takes a lot of courage, a lot of self-compassion, and a lot of open-heartedness. And I was so present to all of those qualities in Julie as we explore her story. We dive into the importance of self-compassion and how to love and embrace your authentic self, the joy of unmasking yourself, following your light, and recognizing your natural patterns. We also explore what that looks like through the lens of running a business outside of the box. Like, what does it look like to truly run your business on your own terms and in alignment with your own values? We explore how that's really connected with following your energy and prioritizing your intuition instead of the constant to-do list as a neurodivergent entrepreneur. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to offer you up one final invitation to join me in person on Monday, August 5th at 12 noon Eastern Time for our final non-networking power hour before we take a break for the fall months when I'm on maternity leave. If you've been looking for an opportunity to connect and make more meaningful, values-aligned relationships with empathic entrepreneurs, and lean into your edge of asking for meaningful support and opening yourself up to be supported in a deeply impactful and safe environment, come join join us. We would love to have you. I'll drop the link for that as well as for our private free online community in the show notes. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Prosperous Empath podcast, designed especially for empaths and highly sensitive entrepreneurs just like you who are committed to achieving holistic success. I'm your host, Catherine Wood, Master Certified Coach, author, mastermind leader, and founder of Unbounded Potential, a boutique coaching firm for empathic entrepreneurs. I'm on a mission to bring empathy back into the world of business. Each episode will focus on achieving more by doing less through leveraging empath-friendly leadership practices, boundaries, rituals, and systems, all the while continuing to care deeply about ourselves, others, and the world around us. If you are committed to joyful living and running a conscious business, but amassing wealth while doing so, proving that you can have both in a society that tells you you can't, then you are in the right place. Join me here each week to find out how. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you'll find all the show notes and helpful resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Julie, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I think I've known a lot about you for many years, so this feels like such a wonderful excuse to connect and get to know you on a deeper level. And for my listeners, I often have the good fortune of chatting with someone before we record, and this is our very first conversation, so I'm excited I'm excited to just dive in. So by way of getting us started, I'd love to invite you to share your pronouns and a little bit about your story, because I think we all learn through storytelling. And I know that your story has evolved a lot in recent months, something that we've been chatting about over email. So maybe we'll hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me, and great to get to meet you. Yes, so my pronouns are she, her, and my story is I am a psychotherapist, and I've been specializing for years in high sensitivity. And now we've been learning about so many highly sensitive women who are discovering they are autistic, as well as we've learned that the guidelines have been wrong. So that's been a big focus of mine. It's something that I discovered about myself, really filled in the blanks for, wow, so many things. And now I'm just thrilled to be working with a lot of women that are also discovering this about themselves. I raised 2 children. They're in their 20s. So yeah, I've been kind of on a self-discovery journey over the past year, and it's been intentional. Really learning a lot about myself after empty nest, after menopause, went through some challenging times during menopause, and kind of coming back out now and finding this new part of myself. So it's been really a beautiful process, and both personally and professionally, actually. Yeah, there's a lot to share, I guess. Just recently launched a children's book for highly sensitive and neurodivergent children. Just launched a guide for understanding women and autistic women for individuals and practitioners, so that we can get more people that understand this. And my goal is always, how do we reduce our challenges so that we can thrive and really flourish in our fullest potential? So that's a big part of my mission.
I know I mentioned this to you over our email exchange that one of my favorite authors, Catherine May, discovered that she had autism in middle life as well. And I've had several conversations with people in my own professional network who have very similar stories. And so it seems like it's truly a theme that's emerging. And I'm curious, what was your journey like? Like, how did you develop you were autistic, and what have been some of the personal and professional blessings and learnings that you've taken with you?
Good question. Well, I had suspected it for a long time, and like many, did a lot of research on it and realized because there was always that piece, and a lot of us would say that it's like, well, I have a lot of autistic traits, but I'm very empathetic, so I can't be autistic, because we were taught inaccurately that autistic people are not empathetic, but that's actually really wrong. So many of us are huge, very deep feelers, very empathetic. And we also have walked around feeling flawed a lot in our lives, because from childhood we were told that how we were naturally was wrong somehow, and that we were supposed to conform and fit into the social norm box. So many women, including myself, learned to mask, to hide the challenges that we were having, and it. For many of us, going through something really hard, like for me, which was menopause and emptiness happening at the same time, I started having health issues, and so I kind of plummeted for a while, and that made me decide to, wait a minute, I've got to spend some time on what is going on. How do I start to heal? And I dove into it more, connected with some people in the field. And the more I learned about it, I was like, wow, this is me. And so I really wanted to do the diagnosis. A lot of women are choosing, some are getting the diagnosis and some aren't. It's a challenging process because there's not that many practitioners that understand that it looks different in women and our criteria has been inaccurate. So that process was so liberating. It was incredibly emotional first, because it was like, wow, if I had known this about myself, I could have supported myself a lot differently in my life and gone through less challenges than I did. Now that I'm kind of over the hump of that process, what I'm discovering about myself and other women I'm working with is that it is liberating to learn this about yourself, to take your mask off, to really show up in the world as your authentic self. I had already been doing that a lot just through my work, but there was still those little voices in the back of your head saying, am I doing this right? And do people think that I'm weird? Is there something wrong with me? Why do I need so much alone time? Why am I so sensory sensitive? And when it's really heightened to like that tends to be a cue that for understanding autism and the differences between sensitivity and autism. So I really dove into what are those differences, because we need to understand this. And what resulted from it, I was just talking about this the other day, about it turned into a process of unmasking completely and really showing up as my real self in the world and in all ways. And it was a beautiful process to do that. And I felt really liberated, that it was almost like all the little flaws I thought were wrong with me. It was like, oh, that is why that was hard for me. Or, you start to reframe your whole life. And now I want that for other women. And that's what's been happening. It's a really neat process that happens, because it's emotional, but it's also like you replace the feeling of being flawed with self-compassion. Mm-hmm. And self-compassion helps with everything. It makes you more resilient. It literally helps you in every aspect of your life. So I used to say there was like this dark hole that followed me around in my life, where if something went wrong, it was easy for me to fall into that hole. And I found out that the hole disappeared when I really understood this about myself. Like, this hole that had been with me my whole life disappeared. And even if I went through something difficult, I didn't fall in a hole anymore. And it was like, it's almost hard to put into words how incredible that process has been.
Wow. That's really beautiful. I hear just so much self-permission to embrace all of you through that journey.
Yes. And you realize, because there's a lot of layers in that, because these messages were given to us with our child brain, not our adult brain. So there is a process of filtering through some of that to realize, like, wow, I'm actually not showing up as myself in these certain areas. And so you kind of go through this process of realizing, like, the world's not set up for highly sensitive or autistic people. So we have to use certain accommodations for, for me, I have like really extreme sound sensitivity. So I have to be careful about that. The sensory overload can activate the amygdala, which creates fight flight. And for a lot of autistic women, they've walked around with these, what I call hidden challenges, that a lot of people don't see the challenge because it's not showing up on the outside necessarily, but it is felt on the inside. So to be able to help other women remove that feeling of being flawed, it's like has become my life mission. It's the most beautiful. And I get messages every day about it. Like, you've helped me love myself for the first time. I mean, how powerful is that? And the ripple effect of that. And
Absolutely.
their families and their children, right?
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate this idea of how getting a diagnosis or identifying with a trait or a quality can provide just so much more a permission to embrace yourself. And I've had this experience with several clients over the years who've pursued various diagnoses, and in doing so, they've really reconnected with parts of themselves that had been disowned or judged or masked, to use your words. And I want to acknowledge I know very little about autism, and I'd love to learn more from you. And I imagine this is going to resonate with a lot of my audience. So if you're willing, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what the journey was to get the diagnosis. You said it was empowering and hard. And I'm also really interested to hear the differences between the high sensory and autistic trait, because again, I know nothing. And I imagine many fall in that category.
Absolutely. I do have and just to let your listeners know, I have a free autism quiz that gives a lot of the details about what we're seeing in autistic women. I also have just published this guide, an online guide, and it's so extensive. So it'll be difficult to share in just a few sentences, but it's very extensive. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that we have different communication styles. And for a lot of, when I say we, I mean neurodivergent versus neurotypical. So and specifically autistic versus non-autistic. And that has been fascinating because the past about how we've been teaching neurodivergent children to conform, to change who they are, to fit in. And that has led to incredibly high levels of depression, suicidality. And because, as we can imagine, when you're told something's wrong with you and you need to change who you are, then you lose your identity. And so this is life-changing information to get out there. And you're not alone, because most practitioners and people don't understand what it looks like in women. So one of the things is that like I was talking about, the feeling of being flawed, feeling like there's something wrong with you, that you're always having this feeling like you're not quite fitting in. You're not fitting into the box. You feel like an alien, like you're outside of things. It's hard for you to fit into groups of people that you don't know, for example. We have really heightened sensory experiences, and it tends to be breadth and width. So it's not just like, oh, that sound kind of bothers me, but it's like that sound can actually create sensory overload, which will activate my fight flight, which will create a meltdown. And so a lot of autistic women walk around hiding the fact that they have meltdowns. And that looks like different things. It may be that it's like fight flight activation. So you may be a fighter, or you may be a fleer, or you may be both. And there's so much shame carried for that, because there's these women like myself, had tons of tools, worked on myself a lot, but I was still having these meltdowns and having a lot of shame about them. And that's something that's really common. And also just needing an enormous amount of alone time. Also, another thing that a lot of women feel really guilty about, that they think there's something wrong with them. But understanding why changes that. So And then also socially tend to be like, you might just really like to connect deeply with one or two people. You're not necessarily someone that wants to be in a group of people. In fact, groups can be complicated. So that one or two people where you can connect on a really deep level tends to be our experience. So those are kind of like some of the highlights, but there's so much to talk about. But that is something, if women are resonating with that, they might want to take the quiz, might want to look at the guide too, and practitioners too, because we need practitioners that understand this. It's getting missed, it's getting misdiagnosed, which is really concerning. I'm working with lots of women who have been misdiagnosed with bipolar, borderline, personality disorders. I mean, really serious diagnosis, happening that is inaccurate. They're put on the wrong kinds of medication. It's a big problem, and we're losing the light of so many incredible women. We also tend to have supercomputer brains. So we tend to be researchers. We get really interested in specific things, and we'll learn so much about these things and be able to take in a lot of information all at once. And we tend to have drastic energy fluctuations. Some days a lot of energy, some days crash with energy. So those are kind of some of the highlights.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So fascinating. You've used this term masking several times. And I think that so often when we learn, whether we're told directly or indirectly to change or how we're behaving is wrong, we put on these masks. And I think a lot of the work that both you and I do in different ways is supporting our clients in unmasking and really embracing all the facets and gifts and weird idiosyncrasies of who we are and how we behave. And it's so empowering and freeing and liberating. And so I would love to hear, what in being able to unmask on your journey of getting this diagnosis, like what parts of yourself have you reconnected with? Like, what are some of the delights or the joyful experiences of that?
Yeah, it is joyful. We tend to have heightened specific interests, but another thing that is sometimes stigma is that it's like you're somebody that's had the same interest since childhood, like you're super into Star Wars or something like that, and that's what you do all your life. But actually, what I'm finding is that we tend to jump to different interests, and dive deeply in a particular area, and then get interested in another area. It's just that we dive in deeper than most people do. And there is such and I want to say too, for people in business, one of the things that comes out that's exciting is like when you finally do unmask and you show up with your real self and your quirky self and your unique self, that's actually what people get attracted to and want to work with, because they start to see themselves in you. And the more in my journey, the more I started to show up and talk about my real challenges, my real experiences, I would always hear from other people would contact me and I really resonated with that story. And, years ago, when I first started out trying to start to share my real self, I would get so nervous. Like I would shake before I was talking about it because I was so worried about judgment. And that was hard. And I know a lot of, especially women in business, struggle with that, to put themselves out there. But what I've found is the more you really do show up as your authentic self, the more people really resonate with that, specifically who you are. So what we think is the wrong parts of us are actually the most beautiful parts of us. And I think that's a wonderful thing too. That's a wonderful message to give.
It is. I find it to be often the most endearing qualities in other people because they're the most truly authentic ones.
Absolutely.
Which is actually a really beautiful segue, because when I first reached out to you about being on the podcast, I wanted to talk about authenticity because I had consumed a couple of your podcasts and you were just so refreshingly authentic on the episodes that I listened to, and I find authenticity to be a really common struggle for sensitive and empathic entrepreneurs and leaders. And I think for many of us, it can occur from some of the very things that we've been talking about, that who we are is wrong or bad, or the ways in which we communicate or show up in relationship or talk is different from how we were taught or what was modeled for us or how we were kind of educated to be. And I think that a lot of the work I do and have done on myself and with clients is really about this very theme, embracing our truly authentic self. It's certainly why I launched this podcast, because I wanted to show a different way of thriving in business and offer other empathic and sensitive entrepreneurs that they could thrive being empathic and sensitive, and how those business models and ways of communicating and ways of relating with other entrepreneurs could look and feel and be different and effective. And I'd love to hear perhaps your thoughts on being fully authentic with an autistic diagnosis or for high sensitivity, and how do we continue to embrace more of our own authentic and quirky selves?
Yeah, that's so great, what the work you're doing. Yeah, I find following my intuition more than my to-do list is an important piece. Following my energy more than my to-do list. Not putting myself in a box, and because usually those boxes don't fit. And so I do things very differently. I talk openly about that too, in terms of how I do business, how I run my business. And because I think it's important that we get these different kinds of messages. It doesn't have to be, everybody doesn't have to do it the same way, that there are ways that work for us. And it's really inspiring to see how many highly sensitive autistic women are kind of carving out this path that works for them, being able to work from home, have their own businesses where they can set up their lives in a way that works for them. And I think that's such a important piece, is that we have to, the other thing I want to say that I think has been a big piece of making my work easier and taking away any fears that anybody might have, is instead of focusing on that external thing where you're thinking, what are they going to think about me? What are they going to say about me? I now, every time I do something, I instead think about, how can I help the people that are listening? So I know that there's going to be at least one person in everything that I say that's going to help someone. So knowing that and focusing on that removes your fear, because then you're talking to that one person. So I would give that advice to anybody that's maybe starting to do video and feeling scared about it, or putting themselves out there in some ways. Think about those people that you are trying to help. Think about those people that you have information that can help, and focus on that. And then the fear goes away, and it becomes this internal mission that you know that you have something that's going to help someone. And that makes everything easier.
Okay, we could take this conversation lots of directions.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me just name for our listeners who perhaps aren't seeing this on video, but I am. So Julie has this gorgeous background. Is this a home office?
Yes.
Amazing. So Julie has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plants behind her and some beautiful rocks and a Himalayan salt lamp. And so just speaking to this idea of creating business out of the box, your background is the epitome of that for me.
Thank you. I love plants. I love nature, surrounding myself with nature.
Same, yeah. So maybe we'll start there, because I think doing business out of the box in alignment with your values, your intuition, your energy is such a juicy topic, one of my favorites. And I also noticed that it's something I take for granted, because the way I've designed my business is very intentional and delightful and joyful, and I love it. And it just works. And I I don't often remember to actually talk about it and share so openly because it's so integrated into my schedule. It doesn't feel special or something to teach or highlight. It's just how things flow and grow and go for me. And I get that really getting an insider's perspective of what it looks like to create that business out of the box in alignment with you is incredibly helpful. So, would you be willing to share your model, your version of how operating your business outside of the box looks and goes?
Yeah, I was actually about to write an article about, for example, since I just launched two big things, the children's book and the autism guide, both things that I had worked on for a long time. A lot of businesses would have been like, we have to plan that launch. We have to, do the launch at separate times. We've got to do it this way and this way and this way. But I have done things completely different than that. If I have something that I think is ready to launch, I launch it. I mean, they were launched within 2 days of each other, which most people wouldn't do. But I don't do things. As soon as I try to put myself in some kind of a box or try to do things in like a restricted kind of a way, I stop being happy like with what I'm doing. I don't like too much structure around it. Like I tend to work from the place of this is what's lighting me up right now. And that shows up in my work because I'm lit up. And I also don't schedule too many things that are like scheduled times. Like if I do too many things that are scheduled in the week, I start feeling overwhelmed. I need a lot of flexibility, fluidity in my work. So I limit what is structured. I really focus on the things that I love doing. I hire for the things that I don't love doing, because that allows me to have more time in my creative flow. And I'm always thinking about that. I think about, well, what do I want to do? What feels right to me, rather than what am I supposed to do or how are things supposed to be in the business world? Because I think a lot of us didn't receive that information, and that information is not out there to do things in the way that you intuitively and feel. So intuition and following your light. That's what I would say. What lights you up is is the path that you are meant to be on, whatever that looks like. Not having anybody tell you that's not going to work or anything like that. But when your light is lit up, people will be drawn to that. And that's what actually works in business for most sensitive people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I imagine following your light is also a good way to manage your energy. And at least I know for me, like sometimes when I'm following my light, I can become a little dysregulated or disconnected from my energy because I'm so fired up by what's lighting me up. So how do you do both? How do you follow your light while also honoring your capacity?
Well, you actually named something important, is that, yeah, sometimes when we're doing what we love, we get really lit up and excited and we want to maybe stay up all night doing something. Or for me, I have to regulate my sleep a lot. So in order to be well. And so I have learned how to get to know my physical, I call it the whispers that your body gives you about what you need in the moment. And most of us are taught to ignore those whispers until they're screams. And then a lot of women, especially in business, end up burnt out because they're just pushing all the time, and they people pleasing, and they're not good at setting boundaries. They're because by nature, we tend to be people that are very giving. We want to give to others, help others. So it's a process of also learning how to take care of yourself and how to be your highest level of wellness. So for me, I now have learned that I cannot skip that intensive self-care that I do on a daily basis. Like my mornings, I get up really early and I'm outside really early before the noise of the world starts. And I spend time with the water birds and the fish. I live on a lagoon, and that was intentional too, which I actually moved recently to be on the water. And I have like times where I spend during the day doing mindfulness things where I'm bringing myself back into my body. How is my body doing? How am I feeling? So it's really about learning how to read that at an earlier time, because I also used to get burnt out. I used to do that grind of pushing, pushing, pushing. Or maybe I was just so excited about something I didn't stop, working all day long, and you forget to eat and you forget to take care of yourself because you're so excited about a project. That is something I've had to learn how to rein in, and sleep and self-care has to be at the top, not the bottom. And that is how I have longevity in business and in what I'm doing, so that I'm not constantly doing the cycle of burnout.
Totally. I mean, the word that was coming to mind for me as you were speaking is self-maintenance. Like it sounds
Yes.
like you've really learned the rituals and practices that allow you to maintain yourself, just like we do every other machine in our life, every other thing that
Yes.
moves and operates.
Exactly. It's just like a supercomputer. It's like when you have a computer, you have too many tabs open, it starts to slow down, doesn't function so well. You need to restart it. We're like that too. Our nervous systems are like that. So it has to be it's a different. And now I am an empty nester, so it's easier to do those things when you don't have children at home. For people that have children at home, that's obviously something that's going to take a lot of energy. So learning how to not skip your own needs, that is the biggest part of it. To be yourself in the world, to be there for how you want to show up in the world, we have to do that.
Mm-hmm. As you were sharing my version of this, it often revolves around overwhelm, because I used to get overwhelmed all the time and was really disempowered by it. And the thing that I realized over time is that I often create and produce in fits and bursts, in seasons, just like seasons of the year. But I don't do just one big thing at a time. And you actually spoke to this also. I often do multiple. A couple years ago, I got married, and at the same time I got married, I was in the process of selling my first home with my husband. And I was also launching an entire rebrand, an entire new website to the tune of multiple tens of thousands of dollars. And all three of those things happened at the same time.
Wow, that sounds overwhelming.
And it was overwhelming. And then I realized that I actually have a pattern of creating in that way. And that I love creating in that way. I love being lit up by multiple projects at the same time. And then I have this season of hibernation and slowing down and maintenance. And that's actually a season I'm in right now as I prepare for maternity leave, just this like beautiful season of maintenance and preparing. And it's so lovely when you start to see those own patterns in your creative output, and then they become something that you're empowered by versus like disempowered, burnt out, exhausted by.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about is acceptance too, like understanding and acceptance of how you naturally are. And I think that's an important part of it. You're not adding the guilt to it or the shame to it, which is the part that is so heavy on us and makes it difficult to recover.
Mm-hmm.
It's the part of like, okay, now and nature is like that. Nature doesn't bloom all year round. And how much we accept that, right? So it's really a lot about understanding and acceptance of how we are naturally, and setting up our lives and our businesses like that.
Mm-hmm. And acceptance is a good word for it, because something I hear in your journey is that there's been a lot of reinvention with this recent diagnosis. And what lights you up in business sounds like it started to shift. So we'll certainly link to those resources in the show notes for this episode. But I guess I'd love to speak on that, like just this idea of how when we begin to unmask and follow what lights us up, there can be more self-acceptance and permission to pivot and to reinvent ourselves in business, but also I think in relationship. I think relationship is another area where we reinvent a lot.
Definitely. And I think an openness to that, and an openness to being true to yourself, whether it's personally or professionally, staying connected to the idea that it's common for us to evolve, and that, I've always been in that. I've kind of reinvented myself quite a bit over the years. I used to be a guide dogs for the blind trainer. I've done so many different things. What's that?
I saw that. I saw that on your website. You have a published book about
yes.
dogs. I saw that many months ago. I forgot that.
Yeah. So I've done a lot of different things. I did that in my 20s, and it's kind of like parenting in my 30s and 40s, and then building this. I went back to school probably in my late 30s to get a degree, in my master's degree in psychology. So it was just like I often evolved and pivoted, and even where I've lived has changed because of different needs that I have. So it's like, I think it comes down to being true to ourselves and where we are, and being open to evolving, and in fact seeking that where we are evolving, because I think that, and it's beautiful because my audience is evolving with me. And obviously many of them are following me because they have related to me, and so many of them are also discovering they're autistic. So it's been this really beautiful evolving process. All of us are evolving.
I really appreciate that. As you were speaking, I was curious, the recent decision to move, was that connected with the autism diagnosis?
No, it was.
Okay.
It was a part of my whole process when I felt like I was kind of plummeting. I wasn't happy where I was living. I wanted to be by the water. I felt like that was going to be really healing for me. Also, I wanted to be closer to my mom for a period of time because of her health issues. So it was like, as difficult as it was to sell my home and move to a different location. Sometimes I don't even know how I did that in the midst of everything I was going through at the time, but so you find strength. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to live my life 1 year at a time. That's what I had decided. So I was like, I don't know for sure where I want to end up. So I'm just going to rent for a while, and I'm going to rent on the water because that is what I know I need right now. And I put my feet in the water every morning. I ground myself that way. It was a part of my healing journey. And so it's kind of like an intentional process to do. I really love the concept of 1 year at a time too. I don't know for sure what my life's going to look like in 5 years. And I'm okay with that because I know I'm transitioning and shifting and finding myself now at this midlife stage of my life. And I'm staying open to those processes and thinking a lot about what I might want for the future, but also spending time just in gratitude that I get to have this experience by the water that has been really healing and beautiful, and part of my process of finding my light get bright again.
I resonate with that so deeply. My husband and I wintered on the water as well. We rented a short-term rental right across the street from the ocean, and I started an entirely brand new practice of daily cold water swimming, which I did in all winter until the end of March when I started traveling. And it was an intuitive decision. I just felt like we were meant to be in a temporary housing situation while we aligned on what was next. And during that time of aligning on what was next, we got pregnant, and my husband got a new job, and we got a lot more clarity around where we wanted to birth a baby. And it was all just following my intuition. And I want to connect some dots here because, we were talking earlier about being willing to live and be out of the box in how we live, how we operate, how we run our businesses. And I think this idea of living 1 year at a time and being open to change and reinvention and accepting that what's meant for us now might not be what's meant for us in a year is so self-honoring. And it requires really being willing to know yourself and honor your wants and needs.
I love the self-honoring. I love that just even hearing that out loud and saying that out loud is such a beautiful thing. And I think it's common for so many of us as mothers to have had a lot of focus on our children. And, even where I was living was focused on where we wanted them to go to school. So it was like, it wasn't where I picked. So I was like, okay, now I'm picking where I want to live. And I didn't have everything figured out, but I took those steps and allowed myself that space to go, let's just plan 1 year at a time. That's it. And it took the pressure off to try to figure it all out right now. That's the thing, when you work from home, you could literally live anywhere. So it's almost like too many options. But I also want to live near some of my friends and family. So there's, trying to figure out some of that stuff along the way. But I love the self-honoring piece, because I think that is something that definitely will brighten our light. And that's what we're meant to do. I mean, there's so much inside of all of us that are meant to be in support of others. And in order to do that, we have to support and have that foundation of self-honoring, to honor our own needs, to have compassion for ourselves and our experiences, to really be open to different paths and how those paths affect us, how we feel about them. Just the process of paying attention to ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the process of paying attention to ourselves, it's such a mind, body, and spirit conversation, right? Because we can so often deceive ourselves, or not trust our body, or not trust our intuition. So, yeah, I guess I'd love to maybe explore that a little more with you. This idea of really tuning in. Where did you begin that journey? Like, how does that look like for some of the folks you work with?
Oh, it's such an amazing process. Like, what I see happen if we don't tune into ourselves, if we're not following our intuition, if we're not following what lights us up, if we're not paying attention to ourselves and our needs, is what I call, we become an empty shell. And I've seen many women come to me as empty shells, where they have lost their identity, they are miserable in their lives, and they just don't even know what direction to go in because they're so lost. And it's a beautiful process to walk them through that journey, of paying more attention to themselves, of getting to know them. And you can literally see them from like session to session. You can see the light starting to turn on. Mm-hmm. And that's one of my favorite parts about this kind of work, is like you get to watch someone come out of that cocoon and turn into a butterfly. I mean, it's the most beautiful thing. And it becomes this ripple effect too, because they generally go out into the world and they're doing something great with it. And I think that for a lot of us, that process can come after a time of really intense challenges. I think I heard Oprah talk about that once, that it was like sometimes when you're in the most difficult parts of your life, it's almost like a signal to pivot. And that pivot is needed.
Yeah.
And it isn't, you don't have to have everything figured out, but even if you are just beginning the process of paying attention, it's so important.
Oh, I agree so much. I mean, I'm smiling ear to ear as you say that, because something I say in my work a lot is that we have to break down to break through. Like the breakdown, it always is before the breakthrough. And, in the beginning, when I started coaching a decade ago, I used to get really enrolled in my clients' breakdowns and problems and get overly invested, and I'd feel overly empathetic, and I'd really sympathize with their pain and their hardship. And over the years, as I've done my own work and become more and more detached and don't take their stuff so personally, I've found a lot more joy when clients reach that point, because I know what's to come. I know what's on the other side. I know what there is to look forward to if we're willing to not stop there, if we're willing to keep leaning in with curiosity and self-compassion and maybe a little awe.
Yeah, you're so right. Because when you've been through this process yourself too, it's like you kind of know what it's like over there. How much better it gets. And to be able to kind of be somebody's guide through that, it's so incredible because you're like, I know what this feels like. I know what they're going through. But there is a spark in them. There's a spark that made them reach out in the first place, to work with us. And that spark excites me because I'm like, okay, they're on that journey. They're going to get there. And that is exciting. And that's the part that I want to get them to. So that's the part we start to focus on.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? I often think like all the challenges and incredibly hard times of my life all seem worth it now to me because it's like I bring that experience and knowing into this process. And it's like, oh, that's maybe why I had to go through all that, because now I can be someone's guide to get them across that bridge, I call it, to get to the other side where it's really beautiful over there.
Totally. Yeah. And the visual I had is that sometimes we just need that person to hold the light when we can't see.
Absolutely. Yes.
Walk with us. Well, this has been just as beautiful and delightful of a conversation as I expected. As we wrap today, I always invite my guests to share what supported you in becoming a prosperous empath.
The most important part was building a self-compassion practice. And it's a brain training technique. I'm very into brain training stuff. And you can grow self-compassion. And self-compassion literally helps with every single part of your life. It is the most important thing. I started out with 0 self-compassion when I first started my practice. There's like a 3-step process where you're activating parts of your brain that are actually calming centers when you do that deactivate the stress centers because they can't be activated at the same time, which when I found that out, it was like the most amazing thing. I was like, what? You could deactivate stress centers? Okay, sign me up. So I would say self-compassion practice. Definitely.
What's the third part of the process?
So the first step is that you are naming your emotions because that activates the cognitive brain. And just by being able to come up with the words, so you're about 50% starting to feel supported. And then the second step is to normalize and validate. It makes sense that I'm feeling these emotions. To normalize might be, other sensitive people most likely feel the same way. And then the third step is a check-in. So you're really checking in with what do I need right now to support myself right now? And if you keep on practicing that on a daily basis, you actually start to feel it, like it starts to work. And it becomes something essential, whether it's personal or business. Something goes wrong in your life and you don't have a self-compassion practice. For me, it was a bit like having a foundation of toothpicks where I felt like it would break. My foundation would break and I would fall apart. But with self-compassion practice, I have a strong, solid foundation where I no longer fall apart. I can support myself through everything that is challenging or heightened emotionally, and is absolutely the thing I recommend the most is to work on that. I could link you to, I have a free video where I teach that too. I could link that for you also.
Yeah, by all means, we'll include it in the show notes for the episode. Julie, thank you so much for today. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking with you.
Thank you so much for listening today to this episode of the Prosperous Empath Podcast with me, Catherine Wood. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review so you don't miss an episode and so more empaths just like you and me can find the show. As a thank you, each month, one lucky reviewer will receive a 60-minute coaching session with a member of our Unbounded Potential team. You can find all the show notes and bonus resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Thank you so much for listening and locking arms with me to bring empathy and prosperity back into the world of business.